Hey, well, welcome to Real Life this weekend. Really glad to have you here. Want to welcome everybody inside, outside, those of you watching online, and especially our friends over at Canyon Country. So glad that you are joining us as we wrap up this series, Stranger Things. How many of you, by show of applause, decided to watch the series because of this series? Okay, a few of you. All right, so I'm on the take with Netflix, so I get a little kickback from that, so I just appreciate that. Thank you very much. No, in all seriousness, it doesn't matter if you've seen the show or not. The series is all about strange things of faith, and we kind of play off the series just a little bit. But we've been talking about things like, what's out there, and we've talked about angels and demons. We've talked about how we all follow a Christ figure through our stories. Is it because we're longing for a Christ? And last week, we talked about the afterlife, and if you missed out on that, boy, you missed out. Make sure that you go to the website and watch that, and then share that with somebody. I've already shared it on social media. I've shared it with specific people and just said, listen, this is somebody who's interviewed over 1,000 people that had near-death experiences, and it's amazing what they learned. People are intrigued by that. Share that with somebody. Get the word out that heaven is real, and we see how their experiences validate the Bible rather than the opposite of that. And so today we're going to wrap up this entire series by asking a question that a lot of us are really kind of wrestling with. And that is this idea of, are we living in the end times? You see the news, you see stuff going around, and you think, boy, things are really bad. Are we living in the end times? Is this, is the world going to end soon? I mean, it's got to end sometime. Second law of thermodynamics, everything's driven to disorder. It's going to end. Is this when it's going to end? Is it going to end on my watch? Is it going to end in my lifetime? These are the questions we want to know. And these are some of the questions that are answered or talked about in Stranger Things. I mean, the things that are going on right there, they begin to think, could this be the end? Certainly of our town, but maybe of the world as well. Is it really the end of the world as we know it? Now, a few months ago, I sat down with my family to watch family movie night. Okay, maybe you do this, but we do family movie night, and we've kind of moved through different seasons of our life of what movies we're going to watch, and it was a kid's choice on what we're going to watch, and so we sat down for a nice family film, and it wasn't Herbie Goes Bananas, it wasn't The Black Stallion or anything like that. No. We watched San Andreas. That's right. Where they just completely destroy Southern California all the way up into Northern California, and we figure out that the only person that can save life as we know it is The Rock, which I think most of us already believed, right? That's the way it's going to be. He's always our Christ figure in all stories. And San Andreas just basically splits the state in half, and it's just destructive and all that. And I hear they're making a second one, which I don't know what they're going to do now. They pretty much destroyed everything. And that's just the devastation of that area. That's just California. But what about when you see movies like 2012 or The Day the Earth Stood Still, or Armageddon or those kind of things? We begin to wrestle with these questions of, what would I do? Where would I go? What's going to happen? What's it going to be like? Now, you're watching a movie and it's one thing, but you start watching the news and you think another. I mean, think about the things that have just happened in the last 12 months. Think about the natural disasters like the hurricanes that we've seen and the earthquakes that we've seen. Think about the horrific events like what happened in Sutherland Springs, Texas, and the shooting in Las Vegas, and the shooting in San Bernardino, and the shooting in Paris, and all the other terrorist activities that we see. The rise of ISIS, diseases like Ebola that are going around, and the attempts to contain it. The horrific images we see of people being beheaded overseas and Christians losing their lives as well. And we see all of this news coming out, and it seems to just get worse and worse and worse. And there's something inside all of us that goes, eventually this has got to end. Eventually this is just going to get to the point where the world ends. Is the end near? I mean, I think this is kind of what we all want to know. Let me just put a clock up here for a second. We want to know what time it is. Here's what I mean by that. If the world ends at 12 o'clock, we want to know, is it 11:55 right now? Is it, 2.5 minutes to midnight according to the doomsday clock that, we should all tune into? Or is it like, 11:05? Okay, because if it's 11:05, I'm going to live a little bit differently than if it was 11:55. We want to know how much time we have left. And because of that, we want to know, what are the signs of the end of the times? When will we know when the world will end? and you look at all this stuff you see on the news, and you feel all this stress that our country is feeling, and the world is feeling, and our culture is feeling, and it feels a lot like 11:55. Aren't you glad you came to church today? Isn't that encouraging? Well, just to bring a little bit of brevity to this, I heard a story about a couple of pastors. They each had churches on two separate corners of a very small town. And they went outside and they put signs in their front yard of their churches. And one said, "Turn yourself around before it's too late." And the other sign said, "The end is near." And they were kind of looking at each other across the street, congratulating each other for their crafty signs. About that time, here came this carload of teenagers just blaring through that intersection. And they see the signs, and they're hanging out the window yelling, "You guys are a bunch of freaks. You're a bunch of fanatics," and they just drive off. And then you hear tires squealing, and you hear the splash of water. And the pastors look at each other, and they said, "Maybe we should have just said, 'Caution, the bridge is out.'" There you go, everybody. Thank you very much. I'll be here all week. Tip your waitresses. Now, that's funny. I don't care who you are, but the reality is, what we're talking about today, it's kind of scary stuff. As if angels and demons wasn't scary enough, as if putting on the spiritual armor of God to protect yourself against the schemes of the evil one wasn't scary enough, as if the idea of life after death and the curiousness of all that isn't kind of scary enough. We're talking about, when will the world end? Are we living in the signs or in the end of the times? Now, this is a question that Jesus' closest friends, his disciples, actually asked him. In fact, there were eyewitnesses around Jesus writing down all these things, and these followers of Jesus would later write down these documents. And in Matthew's telling of this, in chapter 24, we read about a time that Jesus is sitting on the Mount of Olives, where he'd often like to go to sit and pray, which is also where the Garden of Gethsemane is, where he goes for his final time before he prays, before he goes out and he is crucified. And it's on this Mount of Olives that he's looking out over the city of Jerusalem, and he's just talking to these guys, and they want to know about the end of the world. Take a look at what they say. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately because they think that he won't tell them in front of everybody else. And they say, "Tell us, when will this happen?" Because Jesus has just been talking about the end of days. And some of the stuff in Matthew 24, quite frankly, is about the end of the world. And some of it's about the end of Jerusalem, because it will be destroyed in about 70 years from the moment Jesus is sitting there. And they say, "When will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" Now here they're specifically talking about Jesus. When are you coming back? Because he's already begun telling them that I'm going to leave for a period of time, and then I will come back, and that is when the end is here. And they want to know, when is that going to be? Now here's what's interesting. Jesus will tell us a lot in this chapter about what it will be like. And he tells us a lot in a beautiful description about what it will be like when Israel or when Jerusalem is destroyed, and also what it will be like when he comes and the world ends. But he does not tell us when. So, if you're asking, are we living in the end times? The most honest answer I can give you is this: I don't know. Maybe. But Jesus never specifically says when. But he does tell us what some of the surrounding things will be like. And just as a word of warning, every generation thinks it will happen in their time. And we all look at the signs and we say, it must be now. But with that in mind, what are the unique indications that signify that the end is near? Now, we don't have the kind of time to get into all kinds of biblical prophecy, but I'm going to give you just three, just for you to chew on a little bit mentally. Here's the first one: the regathering of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. Why is that a big deal? Well, because in Jeremiah 16 and in Isaiah chapter 11, it indicates that at one point in history, in the future, the Jewish people will no longer refer to themselves as the ones that God led out of Israel, or out of Egypt, but rather they'll be known as the people God brought back to Israel. And in 1900, there were about 40,000 Jews throughout the land of Palestine. After World War II, there was about 500,000. You know how many there are today? 6.3 million. They've come from Europe, they've come from America, they've come from Russia, they've come from Ethiopia, they've come from all over, and it's miraculous. There's a regathering of the Jewish people into Israel. That's one of the signs of the times. Here's a second one. The reclamation of the land of Israel. In other words, over the centuries, the land of Israel has been desolate and burned and destroyed. In fact, in 1900, there were only 17,000 trees left in Israel. Now, how do we know that? Because the Turks who were ruling them at the time would tax them based upon how many trees were in the land. They just counted the trees, taxed them on that. So the way you cut taxes is you cut down trees. And so people started cutting down trees left and right till there were only 17,000 left. 1900 is when there were 17,000 left. Today, there's over 450 million trees, which goes along with what Ezekiel said. Take a look at this. They will say, this land that was laid waste has become like the Garden of Eden. Now this has begun to happen. Here's a third thing just to think about. Another sign is going to be the rebirth of Israel as a nation in 1948. Ezekiel 37 prophesies that at one point these dry bones, which are this kind of the nation of Israel, God's chosen people, will begin to come back to life. And in 70 AD, when Jerusalem was destroyed, everybody thought this will never recover. And the Jewish people, as we knew them, were scattered all over the world for 18 centuries. But then on May 14th in 1948, 3 years after World War II, the Jewish people began to gather once again in Palestine, right by Israel, and began to declare, we're back. And they declared themselves as a nation once again. In fact, Jesus goes so far as to talk about in a lesson with a fig tree that dies, and he says that this is kind of symbolizing Israel and that the people of that generation will see him return. Well, if you just do the quick math on that, if he's talking specifically about the generation that comes after Israel comes back together, that begins in 1948. Average generation lasts somewhere between 70 and 80 years. That puts Jesus' second coming somewhere around 2018 to 2028. It's 11:55, friends. So it looks like from some of these signs, depending on what you want to do with these, we are closer than ever before, and we truly are living in the end times. Maybe. Now, the people of Jesus' day, they wanted to know these same things. And so one of Jesus' closest followers, a guy by the name of Peter, said, I'm going to tell you what it will be like when Jesus returns. And he begins to write down all of these descriptions of what it will be like. And I want to read through some of these, and I want you just to ask yourself, does that sound like today? Because Peter is talking specifically about here's the climate, here's what it will be like, these are the situations, and this is what people will be saying. And take a look at what he begins to say in this passage. He says, above all, you must understand that in the last days, scoffers will come, scoffing and following their own evil desires. In other words, there will be people that will say, you know what, if it feels good, do it. I don't care about moral law or religious law or even government law. We're going to do whatever feels good to us, and we're not going to listen to the Bible or the government or the laws of man or anything. Has that happened yet today? Perhaps. He continues like this, and he says, they will say, where is this coming he promised? Ever since our ancestors died, everything goes on as it has since the beginning of creation. In other words, we've heard that Jesus is going to return, but you all have been talking about that for 2,000 years. He hasn't come back yet. He's not coming back. He continues. But they deliberately forget that long ago, by God's word, the heavens came into being, and the earth was formed out of water and by water. In other words, there was a day when God said, let there be life. And there was. And life was created, and the world began. And God spoke that into an existence in a day. He continues. By these waters also the world of that time was deluged and destroyed. In other words, there was a time when there was a day when God said, now I'm going to start over. And he wiped everything out and began again. And then Peter continues. By the same word, the present heavens and earth are reserved for fire, being kept for the day of judgment and the destruction of the ungodly. Here's what he's saying. There will come another day when God says, time's up. There will come that moment when it's no longer time left on the clock. And then he says this, but do not forget this one thing, dear friends. With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. Now, I think this is just Peter's way of saying, just slow down. Those of you that are so nervous about when's it going to happen, just calm down a little bit. God doesn't see time like we do. But I think it's also Peter's way of saying, but stay alert, because our time is not like his, and you never know how little time you have left. In fact, some Jewish scholars think that this 1,000 years word basically means 7 days, each day meaning 1,000 years. And if you trace back to Adam and Eve from the beginning of civilization as we know it, that's about 4,000 years till Jesus, just from the first man to Jesus. And then 2,000 years after Jesus, that's 6,000 years. And some of you are thinking, good, I got another 1,000 years, I'm good. But if some scholars think there's going to be another 1,000-year reign at the end of that, and that it's kind of already begun or tacked on to the end, so you don't really count that. In other words, we're right in the middle of it. And as the atomic doomsday clock would say, we're 2.5 minutes to midnight. Is everybody okay? Take a deep breath. Look how he continues. The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. Instead, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. Can I just tell you how much I love this verse right here? Because this tells us so much about the nature and the character of our God. He is not a God who has no power and will not fulfill his promises, but he is a God who is patient. I almost see this imagery like the Father in heaven looking down on earth with Jesus at his side, and he says, okay, I've had enough, go get him. And just before Jesus starts to leave, he says, hang on, there's one more that's about to come to faith. And that's why God has waited year after year after year after year for you to say yes to him. The very reason that we are still here at this time is because he is still waiting for more to come to repentance. That's how good and how patient and how loving our God is. And by the way, for those of us that really like to try to figure out the exact day he will return, he says this. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief. The heavens will disappear with a roar, the elements will be destroyed by fire, and the earth and everything done in it will be laid bare. No one calls you up and says, about 3 a.m., I'm going to break in your house, so if you just lay all your jewelry out, that'd be great. Just letting you know. A thief does not call ahead. And he says, you will not know. But here are the signs. So let me ask you this question. Does any of that sound like what we're living in right now? Is there anything about what we just said that makes you think, that kind of sounds like today? Well, let me just go over 3 things that I think are pretty ironic. Here's the first thing. Sign number 1, people are going to be distracted by life. Anybody distracted by life right now? Some of you right now are distracted by life. Some of you are on your phones, you're making out a grocery list, you're on Facebook, you're checking fantasy football scores. I get it, okay? I'm doing it too. It's on the screen in front of me. I'm just checking it, whatever. The reality is all of us are distracted by life. All of us have a lot going on. All of us think about other things besides God. And here's what he's saying. That's what it's going to be like. People are going to be so distracted by life that they're going to miss out on what real life is all about. You see, we all need to ask ourselves, how much of this world are we focused on, and how much of the next world are we focused on? I mean, has anybody else since last week just been thinking about heaven a little bit more? Boy, I have. And that's probably the way it ought to be all the time, because the reality is, even though we may not be living in the end times, you are living in your end times. Because you and I are not guaranteed tomorrow. You never know how long you have. Will the world be around for another 1,000 years? Maybe. Another 5,000 years? Could be. Who knows? But what we do know is we won't be. And while we may not be living in the end times, we are living in our end times. And unfortunately, life distracts us from that reality. Does God want you to enjoy your life? Absolutely. He gave you the capacity for happiness and pleasure and fun. But he also wants you to realize this is a small comparison compared to what's next. Don't be distracted by this life. Here's the second sign. See if this is true about our age. People are going to forget God. I mean, this is certainly true about the world we're living in right now. I mean, and here's the interesting thing about our world. While the gospel is spreading quicker than it ever has before, and more people are coming to faith than ever before, in fact, in China alone, it has gone so far that there's usually about 35,000 new believers every single day. Now, almost 10% of China considers themselves believers and followers of Jesus in a church that is underground and persecuted for their faith. Now, in America, where it's free to have faith, it's in decline. Now, in some churches, fortunately like ours and others, it continues to grow. We continue to see new people come to faith in Christ. But the reality is, in our country, people's interest in following after Jesus, not just acknowledging he exists, but following after him, is declining rapidly. Can we just do a little bit of sociology here? Let's talk about the generations. We go back to the builder generation, the greatest generation. Okay, these are probably your grandparents or your great-grandparents, born somewhere between 1927 and 1945. 65% of that generation would consider themselves followers of Jesus. You go to the next generation, the boomer generation, 46 to 64. There's a sharp decrease down here to 35%. These are the people that are leading our companies, the CEOs, the judges, the politicians, the pastors. Not all pastors, but some pastors are in this generation. Some are in the next generation, okay, which would be the Gen Xers, okay, 1965 to 83. But notice the sharp decline here. 16% are now followers of Jesus out of this generation. But then you take a look at the current generation that we're in, the millennials, 84 to 2000, just 4% consider themselves followers of Jesus. Friends, this is why we are so committed to reaching the next generation. This is why we put so much effort, time, and attention and resources into real life kids and student ministry and junior high ministry and the bridge. This is why we're building another building to house students around here. This is why we send kids to camp. This is why we keep trying to be as creative as possible. And you might sit around and think, I don't like the lights. I don't like the smoke. I don't like the music. You know what? Who cares? Because it's about this generation right here. Because think about what a mess our world is in when 35% are followers of Jesus. They're the ones leading this place. What happens when this percentage starts leading this world? I mean, it is on us to pass this on to the next generation. And we can't sit around and talk about, but I want, and I'd like, and I prefer. Forget it, friends. We had our day. It is about making sure that next generation knows and follows Jesus. That's what it's about. Because one of the signs of the times, we are living in a culture that has forgotten about God. Now, here's the third sign. People are not going to be ready. I mean, the reality is that it will sneak up on all of us. Jesus says, 2 will be at a well, 1 will be taken, 1 will be left. 2 will be in bed, 1 will be taken, 1 will be left. So Jesus says, keep watch because you do not know the day the Lord comes. You do not know. Now, I know some of you really like this kind of stuff, and you read a bunch of books, and you get into all the things about the blood moons and the computer chips and the 666 and all that kind of stuff. And I got to be honest with you, it is fascinating stuff. But if you figure out a day that Jesus is coming, write it in pencil. Okay? And here's why I tell you that. Here's what Jesus says. But about that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. I don't think God's going to tell you before he tells Jesus. Okay? You're not going to know. I'm not going to know. We're just guessing. The reality is you're not going to know the day, so be ready. You really don't need to know what time it is. You just need to know how much time and what to do with the time you have left. You really don't need to know what time it is. Are we in the end times? Is it 11:55? Is it 11:05? You really just need to know what to do with the time you have left. So thankfully, Peter told us that as well. Take a look at what he writes here in his first letter. He says, the end of all things is near. Well, that's encouraging, Peter. Can you tell us a little bit more? He says, all right, I will. Therefore, be alert and of sober mind so that you may pray. He says, earth is not the ultimate reality. There is something more. And we just get so focused on the natural world, we forget about what's next. So here's what he says to do. I want you to think clearly. In other words, you've got to recognize there is something greater than this right now. 62% of Americans believe that Jesus is coming again, but that only 8% are actually living for him. That math doesn't really add up to me. If you know he's coming back, why wouldn't you be prepared for him? And friends, you know how I know we're not prepared? Because we obsess over things that are so temporary. How many times have you spent time praying and praying and praying about something that really does not even matter? How many times have you worried and worried and worried about things that aren't going to be eternal? I know I have. And the reality is it's because I'm not thinking clearly. I'm not thinking as a citizen of heaven. I'm thinking as somebody who's consumed with the now. I need to think clearly. Here's the second thing. He continues on with this verse. Above all, love each other deeply, because love covers a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Isn't this appropriate we read this before Thanksgiving? Before people roll into your house and you're back there just grumbling, who invited all these people, you know? Before you just go into a coma in your recliner hoping that everybody leaves, here's what he says, love each other deeply. Here's what this means. Here's the second thing you and I need to do to be ready, and that is I need to focus on my relationships. Some of you, this is easy to do. You're an extrovert, you love people, you thrive on people, but some of us are not. And it's a drain sometimes, but the reality is we need each other. The church is not the church until it begins to focus on someone else. And that's why we make such a big deal around here about getting into a life group, getting into a rooted group, joining a CR step study, getting into a care group, any kind of group of people where you're around other people and you take the focus off of you and put it onto them, and you begin to focus on your relationships. It comes a point when you've got to realize, instead of carrying around these grudges, I just got to let it go. And that's part of being ready. Peter continues. Look what he says next. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. You may say, I don't have any gifting. I can't teach. I can't sing. Guess what? There's all kinds of different gifts out there. And if you're a follower of Jesus, you've got at least one. You might be able to do things with technology. Guess what? There are hundreds of people around all of our campuses every single weekend that use lights and sound and video in such a way to be able to communicate God's grace to other people. You don't even have to speak to do it, but you're communicating it. You may have a gifting to work with kids, and you think, you know what, I got enough trouble with my own kids. I don't need to go help out any other kids. But when you sit and you take care of infants, you are allowing their parents to sit in a service and hear about the grace of God. And when you sit and you work with junior high students or high school students, you are helping them to see God from your perspective and not just from their parents, which makes it all the more real to them. When you decide to serve in our homeless ministry programs, when you decide to foster a child through One More, you are helping out people beyond yourself, and you are making a difference. And that's what he says to do here. I want you to make a difference. I want you to use your God-given giftedness to pour into somebody else's life. We mentioned this service slide earlier, but it's just a great opportunity for you to be able to give around here. And it's rlc.is/holiday serving, a great way for you to find something to do around here during the holiday season to help somebody else other than yourself. And then Peter begins to wrap things up, and he says this: if anyone speaks, they should do so as one who speaks the very words of God. If anyone serves, they should do so with the very strength God provides, so that in all things God may be praised through Jesus Christ. In other words, we have an opportunity to pass on this great gift of God's grace to others by the gifts that God has given us. So share it with somebody else. Did you know that since just the last 10 years, more people have come to faith in Christ than in the previous 1,000 years, almost 2,000 years? Because of the use of technology and the use of mission programs and efforts of churches around the world, people are coming to Christ at an alarming rate. Even though America continues to drop, Christianity continues to spread around the world. In fact, Islam began in 700 AD, and for years, there was no movement from Muslims to Christianity. But over the last 12 years, around the world, literally 7 million Muslims have converted to Christianity every year for the last 12 years. That's because people are doing this. And here's what Peter says. You do not know when Jesus will return. So share that grace while you can. Can I give you one last one? Some of you may need to simply receive that grace. Throughout this whole series, we've been talking about Stranger Things, and you thought it was kind of cool and kind of creepy, and the whole thing on heaven was kind of encouraging, but there's never been a moment you finally said, I'm in. And friends, I'm just going to be really honest with you here. You do not know when time will be no more. And you may not be living in the last days, but you are living in your last days because all of us have an expiration date. We just don't know when it is. So why would you wait to get right with God? Why not do it while you still have time? So here's what I want us to do right now as we wrap up not just this message, but this series. I want us to have a moment where you can kind of do that kind of business with God and get right with him. So wherever you are, Canyon Country, Valencia, online, would you just bow your heads and close your eyes for a moment? I just want to lead you in a prayer. And maybe you think, I'm not a person that prays, I don't even know what to say, and that's fine. I'm just going to walk you through it. I want to invite you just to be very still right where you are. Maybe you got your phone out, or just shut it down for a second. Just zero in on what God may be saying to you. If you've hurt God, or you've sinned against God, or you've walked away from God in some way, you're ready for him to pardon you and cleanse you. This is your moment. This is your day. So I want to invite you just to pray these words with me. God, I'm asking for your forgiveness. I admit my sin. I need your grace. And I want the confidence I can have in you of knowing where I will spend eternity. And God, there's a million reasons I have as to be hesitant or say, I'm not so sure, but what about? But God, the one thing I do know for sure is there will come an end to my time, and I want to be ready for what's next. And so God, at this moment, I surrender my life to you. And I want to make Jesus the leader and the forgiver of my life. And I pray all of this in his name. Amen.